Oh boy, I found a nice gem, namely an article by General Colonel in 1937 arguing against Panzer Divisions. And it actually makes a lot of sense and is well argued, so we actually need to look where it was wrong. Yet first, let us start with his conclusion. It must be demanded that tanks are not only or mainly used in special formations, but that they become organic components of infantry divisions. For in order to enforce major decisions, the mass of these divisions must be on hand. Only what the infantry has conquered is really conquered. Only it can hold on to it. So what Colonel Lindemann is saying is that there should be a few or no Panzer divisions at all, but the Panzers should be issued to the infantry divisions as organic units, so fully attached and as such also in support of the infantry. Of course, we require some context here. This was not published in some ragtag journal. Nope, quite on the contrary, this was published in one of the 1937 issues of the Militärwissenschaftliche Rundschau, the military scientific journal. For those who don't know, this was published by the Reichskriegsministerium, the Reich's War Ministry, and later by the German Army General Staff. So this was a rather high-level publication, although not a secret one. Thanks to my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar, I could buy an almost complete set of this publication. Note, I'm not entirely sure, but I think this Lindemann is the same Lindemann that was later involved in the 20th July plot that tried to kill Hitler. Since 1937 both were colonels, yet the article does not provide a first name. Now it is important to mention here that the opponents against motorization and mechanization were more the exception than the rule. The problem is that Guderian made such a claim in his memoirs, and since then countless authors and historians repeated that. Yet historians that looked at the actual debates of the time came to a different conclusion. This image of the military prophet struggling against great odds is attractive to military historians. Nevertheless, it does not fairly reflect the experience of Guderian or the German armor theorists in the 1920s and 1930s. The careers of German tank and motorization advocates prospered. The article is very methodical and initially theoretical. This is also illustrated by the title, which is Fire and Movement in Land Warfare of the Present Age. As such, it starts with a very important statement. Only from movement emerges victory. To make it possible is therefore the top priority of all measures of leadership. The movement carries the fire in the necessary concentration to the decisive points of the battle, in order to indulge in victory with the destruction of the enemy as the final goal. This is also the reason why quite many modern German scholars use the word Bewegungskrieg and roll their eyes at Blitzkrieg, because the Germans were always writing about Bewegung and Bewegungskrieg, so movement and war of movement. For more why the term Blitzkrieg is mostly hogwash, see this video. Now, on fire he notes, fire, however, only allows movement to occur when the space is not free from the enemy's firearms. Space is therefore an important factor in evaluating the possibilities of movement in modern warfare. Be aware that Lindemann will be far more specific later on, but in Germany and also Austria you quite often start with theory because we can. Next, Lindemann looks at the geography and demographics, particularly on how they influence movement. The first one is the lack of space or Raumknappheit in combination with a high population count. The growth of armies into the millions has created a shortage of space to operate. The first war to come to terms with this was the World War. This scarcity of space is exacerbated by the total exploitation of people's power for military purposes by all the major European powers. And here he makes a clear difference between the East and West, noting that in the East there is a larger amount of space there. Yet he also notes that due to the increasing number of soldiers, the difference might be less significant, especially since there's also newer blocking technology, Sperrtechnik, available. This refers to mines, barricades and other means. He continues to discuss static defenses like fortifications as an additional point to the change since 1914. The possibility of an early stiffening of the fronts continues to be encouraged by the increasingly apparent way in which permanent fortifications are constructed. The transition from the fortification of specific sites, which was common until 1914, to the fortification of entire regions or national borders. No surprise here, he particularly mentions France, yet we should not forget that Czechoslovakia also built extensive defensive systems at its borders and within the country. More interesting and probably first error in his assumption is his assessment of fortifications here. It is no longer possible to conduct a war of movement across such installations. Before them, the idea of a large-scale operation fades to wishful thinking. He further assumes that this approach of fortifying one's border will be continued for quite some time. As an interesting point, he adds that this approach is not particularly new and refers both to the Great Wall of China and the Roman limes as well. He also points out that in Eastern Europe fortifications are less useful due to the vast space and sometimes due to the lack of mountains. Yet he notes that generally due to large populations and static defenses the war of movement is not a real option, even though these factors are less severe in Eastern Europe. He then refers to the experience from the First World War. An overview of the World War shows that the movements against our main opponents in the West stiffened after 3 months, in the East a year later. As such, he asks the question, does the introduction of the engine bring back the movement that lacked for the most in the First World War on the Western Front? The question now arises, we for the engine, which gives new expression to the life of our century in all fields, has produced something fundamentally new in the sense that we no longer need fire, or only to a lesser extent, to be able to start the movement with far less difficulty. He looks at the potential influence of the engine on operations and tactics. To keep it short, operations is the level between strategy and tactics. Whereas tactics deal with commanding troops in battle to defeat the enemy, operations is more concerned with the movement and combining tactical actions into a larger meaningful result. As such, tactics are usually associated with battles, where operations are associated with campaigns. For a more detailed discussion, see this video. When it comes to operations, the engine seems to provide the answer to return to a war of movement at first glance, moving formations deep into enemy flanks. Yet remember, the enemy gets a vote, as Lindemann notes, a possible image, if the opponents allow it. However, the engine also helps him. It equally inspires his operational reserves, which, independent of the railroad, as tank divisions, light divisions or loaded onto motor vehicle transport groups, rush to defend or counterattack. The World War has helped the engine to a justified appreciation as a source of power for the movement behind the front. While it is important to point out that Lindemann is not at all doom and gloom, and he's basing his arguments on experience as well. For instance, he counters a previous assumption based on experience that is in favor of armored formations. The skepticism about the assembly of thousands of motor vehicles in a confined space has been overtaken by practice and is often still based on ignorance. Concerns about the dispersal of such closely assembled associations may at first seem justified, but experience has shown that they are unfounded. Yet he points out that hiding motorized formations during a march is a bigger issue, especially since here the engine allows reconnaissance aircraft to outspeed any motorized formation with ease, thus negating the surprise. This is where air superiority plays a crucial part, since it can deny the enemy recon and can also provide friendly troops with crucial recon. As such, he concludes for operations that they can be faster and cover more space, yet they will not be easier to achieve. Furthermore, if one falls back on the considerations made at the beginning, the opportunity to launch a large-scale operation is likely to be less frequent than in the past due to permanent fortifications of entire national borders and the fact that army fronts are nowadays even broader than around 1914. It is hardly to be expected on a Western European theater of war. As such, the next question is if the engine would bring a change on the tactical level for bypassing the strength of the fire. For that, Lindemann looks at the 1918 experience of the Germans and the Entente. He particularly points out the discrepancy in terms of armored vehicles. In this comparison, it should be emphasized that the Germans attacked basically without combat vehicles, whereas the Entente attacked with hundreds of combat vehicles. Yet the German offensives in 1918 achieved several breakthroughs. Lindemann notes, the Germans built up the movement of a breakthrough to be initiated on an artillery fire of short duration but unheard of force. During the offensives between March and July 1918, they always faced long positions of the enemy of great depth. This was in part to the German tactics, namely Stoßtrupp tactics, something I explain in further detail in this video. Lindemann notes that the offensives failed on the operational level due to the operational reserves of the Entente. Meanwhile, the attacks of the Entente were based on the use of several tanks in combination with strong artillery. Yet there was another difference. The Germans defended mostly territory that they recently captured. As such, the defensive positions were less sophisticated than those of the Entente previously. Thus, attributing the Entente's victory to the use of tanks might be a wrong conclusion. Lindemann notes, from the overall picture it can rather be concluded that the change of July-August 1918 is mainly due to the coincidence of two phenomena. A. The overtaxing of German strength after 4 years of unprecedented struggle. B. The simultaneous influx of American force into the Entente front. If we look particularly at the situation of dealing with tanks, there were other issues as well. Not only were German positions rather weak, there was also a major lack of anti-tank capabilities, and the German troops were depleted and exhausted as well. Lindemann notes that modern tanks attacks would face different tactical challenges, namely A. In the fundamental orientation of the leadership of all degrees towards this. B. In the appropriate material equipment of the force. Both aspects are in sharp contrast to the situation in summer of 1918. Lindemann discusses the various developments. He notes that tanks became faster, more accurate and more mobile in difficult terrain. Yet at the same time anti-tank weapons were improved as well. In World War I, a large amount of tank kills was achieved by regular field guns, since there were almost no dedicated anti-tank weapons. He notes that the improved speed of tanks can serve as a defense, yet at the same time it reduces its accuracy as well. He makes a very interesting point. Although the necessity of a sustained fire effect of the tank attack can no longer be seriously disputed, it is doubtful based on war experience that in a short period of time during which a tank attack is in progress, the main battlefield of a defensive infantry equipped with anti-tank weapons can be totally suppressed by the fire of the tank troops themselves. His argument here is that the war had shown that even heavy ongoing artillery attacks with far more firepower did not achieve this, something also outlined in my video on artillery combat in World War I. Based on these observations, he comes to the previously mentioned conclusion that panzers should mostly be non-independent units attached to the infantry and not like the Germans did in World War II, for the most part, independent panzer divisions. So the question now is, why was his conclusion against panzer divisions wrong? Or maybe it wasn't. Well, one thing at a time. Why was it wrong for the initial stages of the war, particularly for the Battle of France? One aspect is his overestimation of fortifications, particularly those covering the borders. As the Battle of France showed, those could be circumvented and as such provide a false security. Additionally, well-trained special forces can neutralize parts of static defenses by various means as well. In terms of blocking motorized and mechanized divisions, Lindemann pointed out the increase in capabilities. While here the main issue is, for the Battle of France, there was a severe lack of mines. As Fries points out, Rommel had about 500,000 mines buried along a 70-kilometer front at El Alamein. By the spring of 1940, the French Second Army had almost the same front width, but only 16,000 mines. Similarly, quite often the defensive lines were just too thin. In this case, we look at the Red Army in 1941, as noted by Glantz. The general neglect of defensive techniques combined with other problems to cause the disaster of June 1941. After the outbreak of the war, Soviet tactics suffered from the same general malaise as strategy and operational art. Understanding rifle divisions, 5,000 to 6,000 men, and rifle brigades, 4,500 men, defended in extensive sectors, 14 to 20 kilometers, and were forced to deploy in single echelon defensive formation with a depth of only 3 to 5 kilometers. In other words, Lindemann assumed a well-prepared enemy. He noted at least once that special circumstances like good leadership can circumvent some problems, but this can't be assumed as a standard. His probably biggest misconception was his underestimation of the psychological factor that a panzer attack could have on the enemy. Although this point about sustained artillery fire is correct, one lesson from World War II artillery fire was that when it switched from destruction to neutralization, it was highly effective. And that was exactly what the Germans did, and he pointed that out as well. The firepower of the tanks might not be as suppressive if it was fired from invisible guns miles away like regular artillery, but tanks also move towards positions and additionally use the machine guns. In that case, a simple firepower delivered per time calculation does not cut it. Similar to the lack of mines and no defense in depth, it is about time to talk about air superiority. In Poland, France, and also during parts of Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority, thus denying the enemy to proper recon while also providing recon to the Panzer Divisions. As such, not only providing mostly hidden movement, but also enhancing it as well. Of course, the final point is, was Lindemann wrong after all? Steven Zaloga makes a very interesting point about the organization of French and German tank divisions in 1940. From a broader historical perspective, the unusual concentration of German tanks in the Battle of France in 1940 was an aberration, albeit one that was highly successful in view of the risky German 1940 operation plan. As combined arms tactics matured, the tank deployment patterns between 1943 and 1945 were closer to that of the French army of 1940 than the Wehrmacht of 1940. The British, Soviet and American armies of 1944 and 1945 all devoted large fractions of their armored forces to the support of the infantry divisions, while retaining only a portion for the armored divisions. So in a way, one could argue that Lindemann was wrong, but only for a very short, although very important point in time. After all, when predicting the future, like with financial crisis or rain dance, timing is everything. Thank you for Andrew for reviewing the script. Special thanks to Usalot for helping me finding some sources. Thanks to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. As always, sources are linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.